Yeah, you can clap for that. That's cool. That's all right. Right on. How's everyone doing today? Good? Right on. Very cool. Hey, before we really kind of dive in and continue on in this Pixel series, I just kind of want to take just a very brief time out just to say, again, as I shared a couple weeks ago, again, thank you for those of you guys who have been just so encouraging and supportive and prayerful about the camps that I've been able to be a part of this year, or this summer, really. I just got back a week ago from a camp out in, get this, in Maxwell, Nebraska, which is really like not even a piece of grain on the map. I mean, it's like a whole bunch of nothing out there. This camp literally is the only thing that exists out there. But it was absolutely incredible. It was about 300 students that came up actually from the state of Kansas to camp. And it was absolutely spectacular to see how God worked and being able to be a part of that. And then I landed just about at 10 a.m. last Sunday, and I was able to come to church. And I actually came to church as like an attender. This church, right? It was very cool. I came in late, like some of you folks do, and I was like, I totally get. Yeah, I'm calling you out right now. It's like, I totally get why they come in late. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying I get it why you come in late. It's very nice, right? But no, it was very, very cool. And so I have one more camp, actually in early September, out in Florida, of all places. But anyways, I just want to just publicly again say thank you for your encouragement and your support and your prayers. It's been an incredibly impactful summer, really for myself as well. Just amazing to see God work in the lives of middle school and high school students all throughout Northern California. So it's been absolutely spectacular to be a part of. So again, thank you to each and every one of you guys for all that you've done kind of in that. But hey, we got a sermon to get to, and we got a series to continue on with. So let's roll through. A quick question. You can go ahead and be honest with me here. How many of you in here, right, have ever actually just like given off this illusion, if you will, right? The illusion that you understand something that's going on, when in actuality, you have absolutely no idea what's even happening around you right now. Yeah, right? Some of you guys like every Sunday morning. Yeah, right? No, right? Some of you guys right now, or you're just in that zone right now. That's cool, right? But we've all been there in some way, shape, or form. I'm going to kind of rewind back with you. Back when I was in high school, it was freshman year, and much like it is today, I believe, you actually had to have a certain number of foreign language credits in classes in order to graduate, right? And so what you may not know about me, but you might know about me, is that really anything that ever, when it came down to it, like when it comes to something educational, especially like high school and middle school, like my whole desire, my whole angle was to just get out of there in the easiest way possible. That's all I cared about, right? Like just get me through it in the easiest way out. So I jumped right in, and Spanish was my language of choice. How many of you guys took Spanish in high school in the house today? Yes, a lot of us, right? We're in California. It's kind of what you do. It's perfect. It works. And then so for me, as I jumped into Spanish, I just thought, man, this is going to be a breeze, right? Because in my limited thinking, I just thought, like Spanish is really just like English, but you just have like an O or an A tacked onto the end of it, right? Like this was going to be no problemo. Like I was diving into it. But honestly, what you know and what I now know is that that is really not the case at all. I mean, there's a lot of vocabulary. There's a lot of conjugation that has to happen any real time that you dive in to learning a brand new foreign language. And so I basically walked out of one entire year of Spanish, right? I walked out of Spanish 1 with the very limited ability to maybe be able to count to like 60 and to like totally know how to translate snow cone in Spanish, right? I knew exactly how to, that's why I walked out with boom, I could fire it off at any point, right? If you were to couple like the 60 snow cones like together, you're sitting pretty good in life, I kind of felt. And so really, I kind of thought, you know what? Like in that class, there was literally nothing that went on that made any sort of sense to me. And what's even more interesting is that what they don't ever tell you is this: Spanish 1 is a whole lot easier than Spanish 2. All right? Because that's when you really kind of dive into it. I mean, you've better have to understand how more than just how to order like several refreshing cups of flavored ice if you want to go far in Spanish 2. And so we would have days in my classroom of Spanish dos, right? I'm getting it. I'm right there, right? Spanish dos, where we literally could only speak in Spanish. I knew I was in trouble. right? I mean, I knew I was in trouble. I dreaded going to class. I dreaded being called on. I dreaded the quizzes. I dreaded every test. I even dreaded movie days, which quite honestly, if you remember back in high school, you have to know that there is no student on earth who should ever have to dread movie days, even if you have to take notes, because movie days are the best. Am I right? I mean, there is nothing better than movie days, but even in Spanish class, watching the telenovela The Destinos, right? Or those crazy weird game shows that they have on, like I could not even enjoy that. And on the days that would be like Spanish speaking only, seriously, I mean this is my whole, this is a true story, right? The only English that was ever spoken was directly to me from my teacher being like, Scott, are you following? Right? Because it must have been like the look that was like permanently on my face anytime I walked through those doors, like of just being totally confused, like, I know what's happening right now. Like there's literally, so I have to be like, yeah, like, see, right? Like I totally am tracking with you here, right? I did not understand a thing that went on in those 2 years of my life, right? Freshman year, sophomore year, I literally blew smoke for 2 years straight when it came to that. And what's funny, now that I've been in high school for about 10 years, I can actually admit that I literally don't do this. Students currently in there, right? I literally found out that I am a very good cheater in Spanish, right? Like that's the only way that I made it through. It was so ridiculous. And I began to wonder as I sat in Spanish class and just like thinking like, I'm not gonna use this. Like this is not gonna do me any sort of good. How am I gonna work this into my everyday life? Really, I don't plan, I know we're in California, I get that, but I just wanted to like convince myself like, it's not that big of a deal, not that huge, don't even worry about it. Like there are even times like I wonder, like, and that was just one class, right? I don't even know how I got a diploma, to be completely honest with you today. Like I have no idea how I actually got a diploma. That's just what it was for 2 straight years. Again, how many of you took a foreign language in high school? And how many remember at least a quarter of what you learned in there? Yeah, hands are going down everywhere, right? You just don't. It is so hard. That's just what it is. And I think as I began to kind of dive into this whole idea of pixels, as we continued on in this series, I began to think that this concept of you and I just like attempting to like make sense, like giving off this illusion that we understand what's happening, I mean, that for us is so true in our spiritual walks as well. And so really, I mean, there are so many things that make sense to us, am I right? But on the flip side of that, there are so many things that we say make sense to us. But in actuality, we are always left wondering that should it ever actually begin to make sense to us, how we would begin to actually let that infiltrate our everyday lives. And sometimes I think that's the case with how Jesus Christ spoke and how he interacted. I mean, because if you were to read your Bible, if you know anything about what's happening here, even what we're going to talk about this morning, we very quickly are going to come to the realization that Jesus said and did some things that, in all honesty, give us a really hard time translating. And I think that one of the most difficult things that Jesus did, as we really try to just wrap our minds around how Jesus just lived his life, is basically one of the most difficult things that he did was how he really interacted with people. Today, we're gonna talk about Jesus' interaction with people and how that translates to you and to me in 2015. Because there are some incredible parallels that we have to understand this morning. And so the book of Mark, if you have your Bibles, open up to the book of Mark. That's where we're going to be camping out today, the book of Mark, chapter 5. And it actually begins to set the stage right here from the beginning of this gospel. Really what we see is that the book of Mark sets the stage from the very beginning for Jesus to literally come into our world and begin to change the way that we think. In fact, he's going to begin to focus. He's going to begin to kind of zero in on the things that we have, on almost trading it in, something that we have for something different. And he's going to do it in a way that you and I would never, ever, ever even imagine or begin to see coming. So this morning, like I said, as we continue on in our Pixel series, If you've been here, if you haven't been here, maybe it's your first time, maybe it's your 45th time, you've been here for every part of this series, right? What we have to know, what we have to remember and understand is that we've been focusing in on these very small aspects of God, right? These little tiny pixels that begin to make up a larger image. And so we've really kind of spun that to look at the whole concept that these small aspects of God are these things that we can in essence adopt, and how they begin to make up the larger image of God himself. It's almost this idea, right, of taking our own distorted and unclear pixels and beginning to exchange them and swap them with a pixel of God that's clear and that's vivid. And honestly, when it really comes to the subject matter that we're going to focus on this morning, when it comes to the pixel that you and I are going to look at today, I tend to err on the side that this pixel for you, this pixel for me, I don't look at this pixel for us as being distorted. I don't look at this pixel for us for being unclear. In fact, for me, I kind of feel that this pixel for some of us is just plain dead. You ever had like a dead pixel on some sort of screen in your life, right? It's this little black box that literally, like, it shouldn't make a huge issue, but in fact, it could ruin an otherwise perfectly good picture. For me and for you, I feel as believers, and I know, please understand and forgive me, I am making a huge blanket statement here. I am just sweeping across a very general kind of statement when I make this, but what I feel at times that this pixel, this area, you, me, myself included, church, we're just not cutting it. So here's the truth of the matter for all of us. As we continue on in this series today, this isn't in your notes, you can write it in there if you want to. But as we continue on in this pixel series, especially this morning, the truth is this: we, you, me, in our individual world, in our own kind of limited understanding of life and the people that we find ourselves around, the people that we choose to interact with, you, me, we have decided with our own set of arbitrary rules and guidelines. We've decided what people matter and what people don't. And that's where we're going to be going today, because interestingly enough, this is not a new issue like at all. In fact, if you rewind like 2,000 years, what we'll see is that the religious people in Jesus' day, right? These are the ones who claim to be closest to God. These are the ones who very publicly claim to care the most about the things that God cared about, right? I mean, these were the ones, they were like the poster child, what they said. They were like the poster child of like the Christian God-fearing world. That was religious people back then. But those exact same people, the religious leaders, the religious people, they were the same ones who were incredibly strict about being able themselves to determine which people mattered and which people did not, who was in and who was out. And so what we read a lot is that we actually read that religion very quickly became this almost exclusive and arrogant thing that began to pride itself on the quality of the people involved. And none of it was done discreetly. I mean, this was all very public, very outward, very apparent how they interact with people. I mean, there was a very clear pecking order. It's almost as if the org chart was always out there. It was posted on the walls of the temple, this whole idea of how people ranked. There was this pecking order, those who deserved attention and those who did not. And what we find is that the wealthy, the healthy, the smart, and the popular, those people were very much included. And on the flip side of that, you had the poor, you had the sick, you had the outcast people. They were not. And you might be saying, was it really that clear? Yes, it absolutely was that clear. It was that simple. So what's crazy is that when Jesus came to earth, when Jesus began his ministry, what we'll find, and even what we're going to read this morning in the book of Mark, is that what we'll see is that Jesus started making his rounds, if you will. And he began preaching and teaching about repenting and almost swapping out this dead and distorted pixel. And people began to pay attention. It was crazy. Those people who were excluded, they were the ones who began to tune in. And they would hear about Jesus and they would listen to him and they'd almost think, you know what, like, I wonder if this guy talking right now is actually claiming something that's true. These people who were outcasts, these people who were shunned, who were shoved away by so many people, especially the religious quadrant, right? They began to wonder, like, could it be possible that I, as an outcast, have a place with this man? Could it be possible that I could be something that's more than overlooked, that's more than shoved away, that's more than avoided? That's what these people over here began to think. And on the other side of that, you had the people who were involved. You had the people who were like the religious leaders. They also began to listen in, and they began to think, you know what? Like, Jesus, what are you asking us to do? Like, Jesus, what's wrong with how I'm acting? What's wrong with how I'm treating people? What's wrong with the way that I'm living? They began to ask the question, Jesus, why can't we stay privileged? Why can't we stay rich? Why can't we stay more important than everybody else? Jesus, why? Here's the truth, and this is in your notes. The truth is, church, anyone can come around and make bold statements. Anyone can come around and push the limits. Anyone can come around and begin to test the boundaries. Anyone can do that. But it takes a different person altogether. 100% different person altogether to actually begin to live differently. To begin to take all those controversial and surprising things and actually begin behaving differently. And what's crazy is that's what Jesus does. Literally, we see it right here. Jesus comes in and he tests the limits. He pushes the boundaries. He makes these bold these statements that people looked at as being absolutely insane. He begins to stir the pot with his words, and then Jesus actually sticks around long enough to allow people to watch him put his words into action. So the story that we're going to read this morning is actually one that's not unique to the book of Mark. If you're not familiar with how the New Testament works, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's 4 perspectives of the same story of the gospel. It's Jesus' life. And so what's crazy, the story that we're going to read today is not like only happening in the book of Mark. This is one that Matthew, Mark, Luke, that they all cover in some way, shape, or form. And so what we read and what we understand is that that's a huge clue for you and for me to understand that there's something big that's about to go down. And so this story for me has actually become one of my favorite moments, if you will, in the ministry of Jesus. I mean, this story in itself holds so much punch. I love it because it really has 2 stories tucked into one. It's like its own little biblical pillow puppet, right? Oh, you just thought it was a stuffed flamingo, right? But no, you unfold, it's a pillow with 11 pockets and a pizza oven. It's incredible, right? It's oh, right? But you'll see, seriously, this is a story of 2 people's lives. 2 people's worlds who begin to overlap. They begin to intertwine, and Mark wants you and I as the readers to understand that this whole thing that's about to go down is a huge, stinking deal. So the story opens up in Mark chapter 5, and there's this crowd that is surrounding Jesus. And what we see is that word is actually spread about this man, Jesus. Obviously, and so anywhere he goes, whatever he does, people are following him all over the place. This guy has an incredible following. He has people that are coming from miles upon miles away to come and just listen to him talk. And this is what goes down. Mark 5, verse 22. 5:22 says this. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came. And when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. Now, this is one of those things I really kind of challenge you guys to really imagine this like in your head. Like imagine there's a movie, like put faces to it, put actions to them, like really kind of flesh this out for me because that's going to be incredibly important to how we continue. And so what we actually see right here is that quite honestly, this really seems to be one of those moments that just starts out like every other like Jesus interaction, right? Like this is like the standard kind of run-of-the-mill Jesus miracle. Am I right? Hold that thought. Back in verse 25. Verse 25 says this, "And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak." Now pause there for a moment. Because what's crazy is that we can't just breeze right through this part. I mean, this right here is like the pinnacle of the entire story. I mean, the book of Mark is short. It is an incredibly short gospel. And so what we have to understand is that when he includes details, we have to know that they must be important. He must be trying to get his point across. So you might be saying, well, okay, what's the point in that? What's the point in just a woman who, as Jesus is on his way to heal a daughter, right? What's the point of a woman in a crowd, some random lady? What's the point in her touching him? Well, for one, we see right here that Jesus is about to encounter a woman. What you and I might not understand about the back then, right, is that really that's actually, boom, strike one for her. If you're keeping tally, I challenge you to do that, right? This is strike one. She's a woman. Back then, honor was everything. And how you obtained honor was through your social standing. And so what we see is that honor was all measured in terms of the power that you had. And so this woman, it was all about the social ladder, and it really came down to a lot of it was about your gender. And so all of this rankings that they begin to place with people with their honor and with their power, that also was a direct reflection of how you were to interact with other people and their level of honor. And so what you have to understand and what I have to understand is that this woman and women in general in that culture, they were low in standing. They were low in honor. They were low in power. And when it came to what was appropriate with how they interacted with people, specifically men, not a lot was appropriate. Not a lot was acceptable. So Mark tells us right here that a woman, she's alone. She is by herself and she approaches Jesus. And are you picturing it, right? In the crowd, sneaking through, touching his cloak. She's not necessarily doing it in a typical or respectable manner. I mean, she does more than approach him, she touches him. She almost weasels her way through this crowd of people, through the chaos of Jesus walking to another destination and the crowd literally like following around him. She does it in a sneaky way. She reaches out and she grabs his cloak. And the fact that she touches him is another very big deal. Not because she's a woman, but because she's impure. She's unclean. Right? Remember? I mean, she's been bleeding for 12 years. She was unclean. She was deemed as being impure, and so she was actually excluded from any sort of temple or religious activity. And what that translates for you and I in our culture today is that she was the truest form of an outcast. She lived life alone. Nobody wanted to be around her. Nobody wanted to touch her. Nobody wanted to interact with her. She was solo. And by all religious terms in that day, coming into contact with an impure person made you impure as well. So you can see why people kind of skirted around her anytime she was around. But of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it's about to get even more scandalous. So this woman, we just read it, right? She spent all her money, all of her time just trying to get better, and nothing seemed to help. She visited a doctor and a specialist and all these different people just trying to figure out what was wrong with her, just trying to nail down the issue, just trying to figure it out. She spent everything she had just trying to get better. It didn't work. So she's still sick. She's still bleeding. And now to top that off, she is broke. A woman, strike one. Bleeding, sick, strike two. Poor, strike three. And all of a sudden, out of what seems to be nowhere, she approaches Jesus in hopes of experiencing a miracle. I mean, the sad case that any religious leader of that day, and quite honestly, many religious leaders of this day, many people of this day would have completely written this lady off. But here she is, willing to press her luck, willing to risk it all in hopes of simply encountering Jesus. But remember, here's the crazy part, right? Her story, the one that we just wildly unpacked, that one directly interrupts the one being told before. I mean, it actually cuts into the one that's already started. I mean, from all appearances, this story should have very quickly taken a back seat. I mean, Jesus should have hightailed his way to Jairus' house because remember, Jairus was a man. On top of that, Jairus approached Jesus on his knees, humbly, respectfully, pleading with Jesus. And on top of that, Jairus was a powerful man. And what we know about Jairus is that he was a lead in the religious world. He was a lead in the temple. I don't think that he was rolling in money like Scrooge McDuck, like diving into your coins and throwing them out everywhere, but I guarantee you that Jairus was not hurting for money. And Jesus, come on. He could have hightailed to Jairus' house because maybe Jairus would begin to support his ministry financially. Or maybe Jairus could make a very healthy donation. I mean, at least he showed some reverence when he approached Jesus instead of weaseling his way through the crowd like we see that this woman did. But the crazy thing about this entire interaction is this. Jesus pays attention to her. He stops. He gives this woman the time of day. He stops in his tracks on the way to Jairus' home. He heals her, this woman, bleeding and poor. He stops what he was doing. He looks her in the eye and he heals her. Now maybe you're sitting here waiting for that whole like happily ever after part, right? If you are, keep waiting. Because what we read is that in the course of Jesus' interaction with this woman who's never even given a name in the book of Mark. She's never even identified as to who she was. Some servants from Jairus' house, they come up to Jesus and Jairus and his disciples and the people around, and they look at Jairus and say, Jairus, we have bad news. Your daughter, she's gone. Jairus, your daughter is dead. So now, in the exact time that it took Jesus to address this woman, to heal this woman, boom, the unthinkable happens. And while it may not be spelled out for us here, maybe Mark's a little bit more tactful than I would be if I were writing the gospel, but here's the underlying message. Because Jesus stopped to help this lowly, insignificant woman, the daughter of one of the most powerful men in town, is dead. Now what? Back to your Bibles. Verse 36 says this: ignoring what they said, Jesus told him, meaning Jairus, he said, Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe. So at this moment, Jesus and his disciples, they head to Jairus' house. And they walk up the stairs and they go into the room where this little girl is now laying lifeless. And Jesus looks at her, and in verse 41 through 42, it says this: he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. And immediately the girl stood up and walked around. At this, they were all completely astonished. See, right here, maybe now is when you think, release the doves and the butterflies. Happily ever after has now happened. That should apply. I mean, here we have everyone who got what they wanted. Everyone is better. Everyone is healed. Everyone has what they wanted. But I feel for me when I read this story that the healings themselves are so beside the point. I mean, come on, yeah, like healings, we have to understand, like as wonderful and extravagant and incredible as they were, healings were predictable. I mean, healings in themselves, they're important, they're exciting, but on the same coin, they are expected. So what if? What if today, as we just unpack this story, what if we began to take a different angle? What if we came to the realization that the crux of this story doesn't revolve around these two miracles that went down? What if it actually has far more to do with this miraculous, beautiful exchange that Jesus Christ participated in? Because we see him in front of our eyes choosing a lonely, insignificant woman over a cherished little girl. I mean, we see Jesus who chose a bleeding woman over a synagogue ruler's daughter. We see Jesus Christ choose poverty over wealth, desperation over protocol. And yes, I get that he did heal them both. It happened. They both were healed. They both got what they in essence wanted. But Jesus did it, making sure that you and I and everyone around at that point understood the complete significance of what just went down. I mean, those people that you and I begin to think they don't matter, the people that you and I begin to judge as worthless and meaningless, instead of that, we have to understand that those same people are in fact actually cherished and chosen and valued. Because the truth of the matter is, no one is excluded. No one is kept out. All are welcome. All are his. And so here's Jesus, who sees far more than just physically broken people when he came to earth. I mean, Jesus Christ came to earth and he very quickly, boom, he saw a broken system. He saw people's faith, where they themselves chose to live in light while condemning everybody else to begin to live in darkness. And Jesus said, no longer. No longer. That's not the case anymore. Jesus says there's a new group. There's a new family. There is a new bond, and it has to do with me. See, church, what we have to understand this morning, as we understand this whole idea of beginning to swap pixels, beginning to take the broken ones, the dead ones, the dim, beginning to remove those out and replacing them with one of God. As we begin to dive into this, Jesus is saying, if you want to be a disciple, it has absolutely nothing to do with your merit. I mean, right there, Jesus begins to simply widen the circle. Well, he begins to say, look, the socially outcast, you are included. The poor are included. The diseased included. The hurt, the broken, the overlooked, all of them included. Here's what I think is kind of funny, right? A lot of us tend to think, well, that makes for like a really good story. Like it's super warm. Gives me all the feelies, right? I mean, it's welcoming. But a lot of us, we begin to think, you know what, Scott, like, things are a little different now. That was 2,000 years ago. How does that work for us in 2015? I mean, things are wildly different. I mean, we have people out there that end result are things like Chattanooga and Charleston and Lafayette. I mean, we have Caitlyn Jenner and Miley Cyrus. We have Supreme Court rulings and Obama. And we laugh a little bit, but isn't it the slightest bit true? See, church, I think that what we have to understand when we talk about swapping out these pixels, when we talk about this whole idea of how Jesus is coming to give us a better way of life, of simply bringing a better way. Sometimes I tend to think, you know what, regardless of what I think, regardless of what I believe, I still firmly know that the message remains the same. And what that means is that we have to make a trade. The pixels, our pixels, they've got to be swapped. They've got to be swapped when it comes to our perspective, when it comes to our boundaries, when it comes to our understanding, because we have got to get this. With Jesus Christ, all are welcome. Church, with Jesus, all are welcome. And while we can stand here today and talk about the fact that, yeah, very easily there are people that don't want to be a part of what he's doing. There are people who choose not to be a part of what God has called us to do, about what God is doing in our world here today. But with him, no one is excluded in approaching him. No one is less important. No one is less than cherished. And I think that this right here means something huge for you and I living 2,000 years after this interaction. I mean, come on, like we live in a way that includes some and excludes others. And I get that it may or may not be a conscious choice that we make, but internally every day we do it. We begin to make these little decisions as to who's in and who's out, and we do it in the form of these little judgments where we assign someone's worth. We begin to assign someone's value or their place or their position. We do it in our heads. We do it in our social circles. We do it on social media. We do it everywhere. And when we begin to make these even small judgments, just these little tiny things, that can be a dangerous thing. There's a German theologian out there. His name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. He makes this statement. He says, judgment is the forbidden objectification of the other person, which destroys single-mindedness. When I read that at first, I thought it was still in German. It was just a weird translation thing that happened, right? You're like, well, what is even happening right now? You are far too smart for us, right? But let me unpack that. It's this. When we judge people, we make them an object. And we very quickly cease to see them as human. And in doing that, we lose sight of the one thing that Jesus has asked us to do as his followers. And that, church, is to love. It's love. I mean, you and I, we cannot begin to allow our sin and our skewed perceptions to get in the way of the exact reason that Jesus Christ came to earth. to actually begin to rid the world of oppression and favoritism and elitism. Instead, we've got to make the decision and we've got to make the conscious effort to begin to make an exchange, where we exchange all of that for the simple idea and concept of love. Because Jesus Christ and his message, it wasn't just for those who looked nice. It wasn't just for those who contribute to the cause. It wasn't just for those who had money or followed all the Jesus rules. Church, the message of Jesus is a message for the masses. The message of Jesus is a message for the masses. And some of us today, we can roll our eyes to that, or we can even begin to say amen like we truly understand what that looks like and that we truly get this. But again, myself included, every single one of us can begin to fall into this trap of believing that we are a part of this exclusive club with some random exclusive rights that no one else has the privilege to have access to. I mean, right here, we have to ask our question, are we willing today, as we are neck deep in this Pixel series, are we willing to begin to make an exchange of everything that we feel that we're entitled to for the small chance that God's way might be better? I think that you and I may be surprised at the outcome. You may be surprised, and you may find that when you and I begin to break down of the me versus them mentality, that the world and the possibility of us begins to open up wildly. You may even be shocked at the relationships that begin to grow, all because of your willingness to begin to make an exchange. So I think the question might be like, who? Who in the world are we trying to keep Jesus from because we think that he's too good for them? Who have we began to judge? Who have we began to form into an object or a sin or a condition instead of loving? Instead of noticing and entitling them to this valuable and worthy individual. Because today you have an incredible opportunity to simply begin to make an exchange, where we begin to exchange exclusion for inclusion, where we begin to exchange barriers for acceptance and judgment for love. I mean, that's what it boils down to. That's the message of Jesus Christ. That's the heart of the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is a message for every single one of us. It's a message for all. That's about breaking the chains of oppression, physical oppression, emotional oppression, spiritual oppression, all for the sake of something much longer lasting and far more beautiful. So today could begin the process where you and I begin to make an exchange, where we step into that process and you and I simply take part in the reason that Jesus Christ bled and died on a cross. For you, for me, and for everybody else. Everybody. Church, pray with me. Heavenly Father, God, Lord, I just simply thank you for this truth in your word. God, a simple exchange and interweaving of stories, God, leaves us with a powerful challenge today. So God, as we sit here before you today, as we stand in your presence, as we worship the God that you are,